think we're going to start without any further delay because we've so much of a rich conversation ahead of us that it would probably take us under ideal circumstances the rest of this evening. But I know I'm under very strict time constraints. So it's a real pleasure to be part of this 11th edition of the ISLA Festival. Laura and I were trying to remember earlier whether I had been at the first or the second, right at the very beginning. I think it was the second, but it's wonderful to see how the festival has grown in the intervening years and has such a fantastic lineup. And it's a wonderful festival that celebrates the best of Irish, Spanish and Latin American literature. So I'm very fortunate to be here this evening to interview these three wonderful, outstanding writers. So I'm going to dive in without any delay with a very quick biography of each. So Moya Cannon here on my left is a poet who was born and grew up in County Donegal and spent most of her adult life in Galway but now lives in Dublin. Her collected poems from Carcanet Press in 2021 brings together her work from 6 previous books over 30 years. And in Moya's poetry, history, archaeology, prehistoric art, geology and music all become gateways to the deeper understanding of our relationship with the natural world and with our past. And Sergio Missana here at the end of the table was born in Chile and is the author of 7 novels along with essays, a critical study of Borges, and he is the co-author of several children's books and a collection of travel writing. He's Professor of Latin American Literature in the Stanford University program in Santiago de Chile, and he's the Executive Director of the Climate Parliament, an environmental NGO that works to combat climate change. And Jordi Soler, here in the centre, was born in Veracruz in Mexico, and he's the author of 10 novels, along with books of short stories, essays and poetry. He now lives in Barcelona, but he has also lived in Dublin, where he was a diplomat for a number of years. And he is a member of that august organisation called the Order of Finnegans, which is a society created in honour of James Joyce. However, Finnegans takes its name from the pub in Dalkey rather than from the work of literature, but that's okay too. Okay, so as I read through all of the works in preparation for this evening, the quotation from Hamlet was one which came to me over and over again. And it was when Hamlet says to Horatio, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." And that's my starting point for our discussion this evening, because bringing together all of these works is that notion of mystery, of the mysterious, of the things that can't be explained in language, a mystery which runs through our history, mystery which runs through our relationship with the landscape. So identity, landscape, the earth, kindness to ourselves and the planet, mythology, the ties that bind us as human beings. You see why we could have been here for the entire evening. So I'm going to begin by asking Jordi if he will read a very short section from his novel, because I think it's always lovely to hear the work in the original language.
Okay. Buenas tardes, gracias por acompañarnos.
Good evening, thank you very much for being here.
Oh. Perdón, lo que leo no lo traduces, ¿no? Vale. Cuando entró al bosque, Ticú pasó por debajo del santo que colgaba de un árbol. La brisa que medraba entre las ramas le insuflaba al talismán una vivacidad que lo hizo sentirse a salvo. Creía que mientras estuviera dentro del perímetro de los santos, no podía pasarle nada malo. Se trataba de una impresión pasajera, que pronto quedaría en entredicho ante la evidencia de todo lo malo que se arremolinaba en torno a su persona. Ya era un hombre muerto y lo sabía, pero el santo y su nahual lo invitaban a pensar que no todo estaba perdido.
Thank you. So, as a very quick summary of the story, Ticú, the main character of this novel, hears a voice which impels him to commit a crime. And this is a voice which leads to catastrophe. I'm not going to tell you what kind of catastrophe because I want you to read the book as soon as you possibly can. And the sense of the jungle in this, of the surrounding natural world, is incredibly strong. But I think what struck me most was the political undertones of the novel. Do you need the question translated, Jordi? No, okay. So I'd like you to talk to us about that a little bit, where you explore, among many other things, the mystery of the natural world, the savagery of the natural world, but also the incredibly divisive force that colonialism is.
Sí, el halo político de la novela es efectivamente muy importante.
The political sense of the novel is very important.
Se trata de un encuentro, de un choque quizá, entre un hombre educado en el mundo occidental frente a una tribu que ha estado aislada desde el principio de los tiempos en la montaña.
It's an encounter or a crash between a Western educated man and a tribe that has been isolated in the mountains.
Por otra parte, el personaje de la novela, el que se encuentra con esta tribu, es un indígena mexicano.
The main character, the guy who encounters this tribe, is an indigenous person from Mexico.
Un indígena que ha nacido en una plantación de café cuyos dueños son unos españoles, igual que los que conquistaron el país 500 años antes.
And he was born in a coffee plantation. The owners of this coffee plantation were Spanish, the same Spanish people who colonized Latin America 500 years previously.
El sentido político de esta novela es, por una parte, el desprecio que existe en México por los conquistadores. Un desprecio gratuito, porque esto pasó hace 500 años.
So the political angle is the disregard that people in Mexico have for the colonizers, which is funny when you think that happened 500 years ago.
La contraparte es la forma en que los españoles, dueños de esas tierras, que eran originalmente de los indígenas, siguen mirando a los indígenas.
The interesting thing is how the owners of that plantation, who are the colonizers, look at the indigenous people who are the original owners of that land.
Ticú, el personaje de mi novela, está entre los dos mundos. Su padre trabaja para los españoles y él es o se asume como indígena.
So Ticú, the main character, is between two worlds. His father works for the Spanish and he considers himself indigenous.
Ticú es la metáfora de México. México es un país que vive entre su realidad española y su realidad indígena.
So it's a metaphor for Mexico. Mexico lives between the Spanish and Mexican realities, and indigenous realities.
And I think within the novel, there is this extraordinary sense of two worlds colliding all the time. In the little piece that you read, for example, Ticú, when he goes into the jungle, he feels protected both by the religious icons hanging from the trees, the little stick figures, but also by his coyote, who's his shape-shifting protector. So the two parallel worlds exist throughout the novel all the time. I think one story really enriches the other.
Sí, esto forma parte de la constelación de casi todas mis novelas. Todas mis novelas están escritas en este territorio.
Most of my novels are actually written in that territory. It is part of the constellation of my novels.
Yo nací en este territorio, por eso, quizá por eso escribo de estas cosas.
I was born in that land. That's probably why I write about it.
And this is something actually I wanted to ask all three of you, so I will ask you first, Jordi. It occurred to me when reading it, I came across the phrase from the French novelist Margaret Yourcenar kept coming to my mind, where she talks about the emotional storage that writers have as children. You know, all of those experiences and locations that feed in unconsciously, which then come out in the writing. And I was struck by the incredibly strong sense that there is of the Mexican jungle and countryside in this. And I think you said in a recent interview that the physical landscape of Veracruz had been very important to you as a child, particularly that big volcano, that big mountain.
Sí, exactamente. Quizá el paisaje es efectivamente lo que determina la escenografía de mis novelas. La omnipresencia del volcán era muy importante para mí.
So landscape is the background, the scene for my novels, and the presence of the volcano was always very important to me.
Cada vez que estaba a la intemperie, en la selva, el único referente era el volcán.
Every time I was outside in the jungle, my only point of reference was the volcano.
Todo este territorio del que escribo ya no existe ahora. Ha sido arrasado por la modernidad arquitectónica mexicana.
Unfortunately, that landscape does not exist anymore. Modernity has taken over.
Iba a añadir que quizá escribo sobre este territorio porque es la única forma que tengo de rescatarlo, de que siga existiendo.
And maybe I write about this land because it's the only way I have of help recovering it. It's the only way that I can ensure it continues to exist.
I think you wrote about it recently, having been taken over now as a shopping centre.
Yeah.
That particular area that you were talking about, which
one.
is horrible, an ugly, an even uglier one than the normal. Can you talk to us a little bit about the role of magic in the book, as we see it in The Coyote and in La Chamana? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sí, México es un país sincrético, vive entre la religión católica y las creencias prehispánicas.
Mexico is a country that has both two types of beliefs, the Catholic belief, the Catholic religion, and the indigenous beliefs.
Las creencias indígenas son muy importantes. Hay zonas completas del país, como la mía, donde la magia es más importante que cualquier otra cosa.
And indigenous beliefs are still very important in Mexico. There are areas, like where I am from, where indigenous beliefs are, and magic is much more prevalent than the religious beliefs.
Cuando yo era niño, nos curaba una chamana. Una chamana nos pasaba un huevo y quedábamos curados.
When I was a child, I used to be healed by a chamana. She used to put an egg over us and we'll be healed.
Seguramente no teníamos ninguna enfermedad grave.
Maybe we weren't seriously ill.
Y cuando llegamos a vivir a la Ciudad de México, fuimos al doctor, que era un señor de bata blanca, y no hacía ninguna ceremonia.
When we moved to Mexico, we actually had to go to the doctor, and he had this white coat, and he did no ceremonies.
That's very
no
disappointing.
No había humo, no había cantos, solo escribía en un papel una receta y ibas a una tienda y comprabas una
Very boring.
He would just write on a paper a prescription, and then you had to go to some shop and buy a medicine.
Well, if we have time at the end, I want to come back also and talk to you about this dual world which you've been writing about in your novel, but also I find it really interesting that you said at one stage that having had a Mexican childhood and that you now live in Spain, you have something of the outsider, so you can see Spain through Mexican eyes, but that you can also see Mexico through Spanish eyes. Yeah. So I'd love to come back to that at the end if we have the time. Moya, can I ask you to read from Starlings, please?
Sure. Es un gran placer estar aquí con vosotros. Muchas gracias al Instituto y todos. Starlings. Some things can't be caught in words. Starlings over an October river, for instance. The way they lift from a roof ridge in a cloud, directed by a hidden choreographer. The way they rise, bank and fall, tugging at some uncharted artery of the human heart. The way the cloud tilts, breaks and melds, the underside of wings garnering all the light that's left in an evening sky. The way they flow down onto a warehouse roof, bird by brown bird.
Thank you. And I find it really interesting that a poet says that words aren't enough to go deeper into the mystery. So you said recently, I love the way things resonate with each other. It is miraculous the way metaphor works. You realise how the world is tied together in mysterious ways and is not a mere construct. So we're back to that whole issue of mystery again. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that informs your poetry?
Well, life is a mystery. I mean, why there should be anything rather than nothing is a mystery. My husband is a physicist. He tries to, just explain to me just how totally non-logical, even the scientists see the world as. Again, I was brought up in a country area actually, and there was quite a bit of, not quite of sort of ritual, sort of around St. Bridget's Day, etc., etc. But I've always been intrigued by the fact that just as in this case, you see a flight of birds, and you say, well, how do they, a flight of starlings, estorninos, creo, in Espanol, and you see them and you say, well, now, who's giving the orders? They go this way, they go that way, and they separate and come back, and this incredible choreography. And you say, and I said, how is it that, I'd been watching them for years. That was one of those poems I was trying to write for 20 years. Right. Sometimes you'll write a poem in a week, rarely. But occasionally there's an image and it will stick in your head for years. And say, I want to write about that, but you either don't start it or you start it and it sits there. I think this was one of these. Okay. And it was just trying to say, why does this affect us so emotionally, watching these birds? And why does something in us take flight as well? And I was just thinking in terms of, when I started to write, it's very mysterious actually. I firmly believe, I don't know if it's true with novels, but certainly with poems, I don't think we choose themes. I think the themes choose us. I don't know, as a novelist, if you find the same. Yeah. And it's very mysterious. I had been studying history and politics and in the early 70s in Dublin, in UCD actually. And but a couple of years later anyway, I started to write. I wasn't one of these people who have been writing all their lives. I'd read a great deal. And read a great deal of poetry, but I didn't start to write, I didn't even imagine I would do such a thing. But when I started to write, I thought I'd be writing, sort of very urban, kind of very edgy, perhaps political poetry. But I was astonished when I sat down. The imagery that came to me is, as you describe, all the things that have been around you in childhood. I found myself writing about the mountains and the sea and the seascapes that I had known as a child in Donegal. I was quite astonished.
So do you agree with that idea then of emotional storage? Do you think that's
Absolutely.
What came out for you when you began writing?
Absolutely. The imagery which is available to you, I think, has been stored in layers right since you're a child. We know that trauma is stored, perhaps even over generations. Yeah. But the imagery which emerges in one's work appears to me to just layer up and layer up and layer up, and you can't contrive it. Yeah, you can't contrive it.
It's mostly unconscious too, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. I once was asked. I'm very wary of commissions. I have written to commission on many occasions, but once I remember in the mid 90s. I was asked was given commission to write a long poem about two cities, about two walled cities, Derry and Waterford. And I was thrilled. I hadn't done any history or kept up with it for years. And I said, great, this is a chance to research and to, read up on the history of these two cities. I really enjoyed the research. I could not write a word. It just wasn't my mode at all. And it was most embarrassing, actually. So since then, if anyone asks me, if I'm commissioned to write something, I said, give me 3 weeks and see if I can pick up a thread. Okay. So yes, it's mysterious in that sense as well.
So do you think it comes fundamentally from an emotional response to something, or a spiritual response perhaps?
When I started to write, I used to say poetry happened at the crossroads where the head and the heart meet, emotions and ideas. Yeah. A few years later then I was thinking, well, it's an expression of the human spirit. And I think I still believe that actually, okay. But what the human spirit is, I do not know. But why do we enjoy beauty? Why do we respond to it? Yeah. All of that. Beauty is completely unnecessary.
Yeah.
All kinds of very ugly, sort of insects mate perfectly successfully, etc. but well, they probably find each other very beautiful, or possibly do, as far as we know. But beauty seems to be a very deep human need, and that's why one of the things that interests me is prehistoric art.
Yeah.
Just the illustration, since it happens to be here on this book, is of a tiny little horse, which I came across in Paris at an exhibition. Okay. And it was from Vogelherd in Germany. It was an exhibition about the age of the mammoths. And this was, in the last case, it was only tiny. And it claimed at that stage, this was in 2004, it's been superseded since, to be the oldest sculpture in the world from Vogelherd in Germany. And it was 32,000 years old. So I can kind of think back to 2000 because we've been programmed. Yeah. Extend that maybe to 4 or 6. But to imagine that 30,000 years ago, this beautifully refined little sculpture had been made, just blew my mind, So I think beauty has been central to our, and why? To our humanity and art from the very start.
And it's interesting that impetus to make art. I remember reading, it wasn't a poem, it was an article, an academic article recently about the discovery of cave art, and a woman described the sensation that she had of walking up. She wasn't allowed to put her hand on the handprint, obviously, but that extraordinary sensation of just putting her hand as close to the handprint as she could, and was exactly a match for her hand. Yeah. And that sense of connectedness then that ran through everything. It gave me the shivers even reading it. Yeah. But just talking about beauty, one of the things which you've spoken about as well, you said there's something in our spirit which needs to believe in metamorphosis. So it needs to believe that something that might be ugly, can be made beautiful through language. So is that something that has inspired your poetry over the years?
Yeah, I mean, change. The things can change. Difficult things in life can change, etc. And again, one of the deep mysteries: how does a caterpillar become a butterfly?
Exactly.
I mean, it doesn't quite turn into a green soup. But I remember just breaking apart a tiny little éphémère, a little one of the little. I can't remember what you call them in English, the little cocoons which are made, these little creatures who live in the streams. And then you could see the little wings, you could see the heart beating and the little wings folded up, kind of just developing.
Extraordinary.
Extraordinary, yeah.
Yeah, you spoke in a recent essay about poetry being a door opening. Is that still what it is for you, all these books later?
Particularly in translation, actually, when I was a young person, beginning to read. I mean, I can't remember who was saying earlier, but Frank was saying, or that Alonso, I think, saying that when you read as an adolescent or as a teenager or as a young adult, you don't think you're reading translation. You're reading Dostoevsky, or you're reading Rilke, or you're reading Tolstoy, or you're reading Machado, and each one of them, I think, is a doorway into a different sensibility.
Yeah.
Because every country, every culture expresses one part of our contradictory nature and suppresses the other. So when you encounter a new culture, there's a celebration of some aspect of your humanity, which mightn't be fully celebrated in your own culture. So it's just door after door.
And that was what you said about Machado, that you liked the way he unself-consciously spoke about the soul.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you were aware back in those days when you were reading Machado in college, because I would have been reading him at the same time, that the joy of discovering that Juan Manuel Serrat had put out his songs, he'd put his poetry to music, are absolutely beautiful and reached a huge audience, I think, in that way as well. Yeah. You also said that it was an enchantment, quoting Octavio Paz, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I will come back to you again, but I want to move on for a moment to Sergio. Thank you for being patient. And I've just asked Sergio to read a very short piece from his novel, The Transentients.
Yes, speaking of translation, this novel was written in Spanish. So I will read a section in English. Something of the sensation of being Aurelio remained with me, and once again I was surprised that just as it had been when I was Inés, it wasn't all that different from the mundane, everyday consciousness of my own self. That intimate commingling was most distinct in the first minutes following the rupture, when I found myself freed of my own circumstances, but not yet subsumed in someone else's. For some reason, I associated it with the different modalities of myself, with the various roles I'd been forced to play, like everyone else, to perform. Tomás, the good student, conciliatory, anxious in the face of failures or success. Tomás, the pitcher of ad campaigns, arrogant, ironic, secret improviser, the efficient boss, paternalistic, workaholic, controlling, seducer, the obsessive compulsive, greedy for food, sex, gadgets, the friend, the husband, the lover, the whiner, the miser, the dreamer, the observer, the owner of Lola, who's a cat. The current self was no more different from Aurelio than he was from the Tomás attending a rock concert or paying a bill. As I reconstructed them in my memory and imagination, I found the junctures between those gear changes painful, jarring. But as I recall them, I was also recovering a degree of self-possession. And instead of undermining me, they lent a greater density to Aurelio's experience. Despite how faint the difference of being someone else felt, it was also a form of freedom, I thought, a gift.
Okay, thank you. And yes, I think we owe translators a huge debt of gratitude. The
Yes.
translation of that, it's absolutely seamless, it's faultless. You know, occasionally one might come across a word here or there that maybe a nuance is missing. Not in that. It was absolutely superb. And I think given where we are in the Centre for Literary Translation, I think it's important to mention that.
Jessica Powell is
Jessica
her name,
Powell,
and she's
yeah.
a professor at University of California, Santa Barbara, in a program on translation. She did a
Yeah.
beautiful job, and I like saying her name.
Fantastic job, absolutely. So just very quickly, the main character of Sergio's book is a man called Tomás Ugarte, who's an advertising executive in Santiago, and he's in the midst of a midlife crisis. He quits his job, he's in the middle of a divorce, and suddenly he begins to experience what initially are called episodes of amnesia. But actually, as the novel develops, it's not amnesia, but it's actually his consciousness inhabiting the bodies of other people whom he may come across or not randomly. So just back to the issue which Moya rose right at the outset of this conversation, where I agreed, in my experience, I believe that stories choose us as novelists, or themes choose us as poets. So do you agree with this novel? Did the stories of this choose you? And where did that inspiration come from?
Yes, I wrote down what Moya was saying because I wholeheartedly agree. I would like to actually clarify or mention that all my novels are quite different. Actually, this is a kind of a strange novel, and some friends that have known me for many years but don't speak Spanish now, I think, regard me as somewhat crazy because, or weird because this novel has an element of the uncanny. But I was mentioning over lunch to the ambassador that actually I had a classmate in college who had exactly this experience. He was leaving home one day, and the next second, without any sense of time passing, he found himself in a completely different city, part of the city in Santiago. And his panic only grew when he realized that 48 hours had elapsed. And this is a neurological situation that is well established. It's called a global transitory amnesia, where you lose some of your recent memory and you have absolutely no sense of that time passing, and there are different causes, and so that I weaved into the novel. Also, as you mentioned, I published a critical study on Jorge Luis Borges. Was actually my dissertation for my PhD in the US. And when I was reading Borges, I was reading a lecture on Buddhism. And at some point, Borges was blind. He addresses his audience and he says, the fact that I feel and I know that I am Borges, and you feel and you know that you are yourselves, is what we all have in common. It's the least original thing about this situation. And it might be very commonplace for somebody who knows Buddhism, but something in that assertion kind of jammed to my mind. You know, when you're confronted with paradox, you kind of your mind freezes a little bit.
Yeah.
And this stayed with me, for many years. And then those two ideas sort of came together into this novel. which is a little bit a novel about doppelgangers, and Tomás or Thomas means twin, and it was a deliberate choice in this case.
Of his name, okay. Well, I mean, it's strange, yes, but strange in a very, very compulsive kind of way, because it's a puzzle box of a novel. It's like, it reminds me of those Russian dolls also, you know, where one story nestles inside another, and it's only at the end where everything comes together very satisfyingly. But I think one of the most interesting things for me was that Tomás, his original impetus, it seemed to me, was to escape from caring, and this is called Constelación, the cuidados, this particular session, that he wanted to escape really in many ways for caring for anybody else other than himself. But he's inexorably drawn back into that again in all of the different bodies or different consciousness that he inhabits. Was that what you wanted the reader to take from this, among many other things? Was that one of the ideas behind the novel?
I think Tomás belongs to a very specific, I mean, Chile is a very class-centered society, too much, of course. And he is he's wealthy, he's powerful, he comes from a family with a prestigious name, which makes a big difference in Chile. So I wanted to create somebody quite powerful, a little bit arrogant, somebody you don't like very much at the beginning, and then strip layers and layers of him toward sort of a nakedness of the self, if you want. So I wanted to give him a lot and then strip him of everything as an exercise of sorts.
Okay, and I think that scene where he enters the consciousness of an old street woman, and again, I encourage everybody to get this novel and read it, but where he enters the consciousness of that homeless woman who's on the streets, I was literally on the edge of my seat reading that, because I knew it wasn't going to go anywhere good. But your day job, as you called it yesterday, as working with the Climate Parliament, you were saying to me yesterday, just briefly, that the environmental situation in Chile is going from bad to worse, essentially, that the mountains which you would have seen as a child, and we were talking about the volcano for Jordi earlier, and Moya's landscape, that essentially that's now behind a bank of smog so that it's almost invisible. So what does that do then to your perception of where you live and the stories you tell or need to tell to bring this to people's attention? Because I got a great sense of the Atacama Desert, for example, and then that scene, I learned later that you were a scriptwriter as well, and this made absolute sense, where you have this astounding rock climbing incident where again we have Tomás inhabiting other bodies, and it became like a movie unfolding, and again very, very tense. So does what's happening to the climate inform you consciously or unconsciously, do you think, I suppose, is what I'm asking? Well,
as I was saying, I've written different kinds of novels, actually in different genres, including historical novels, or I have one novel that is a Western set in Patagonia at the turn of the 20th century, a campus novel. My most recent novel, not this one, is a dystopian novel, and I think my work on climate, and also I did quite a lot of work in Africa with an NGO. That was my previous job. I weaved some of those experiences into a vast, ruined Latin American city. So I would say recently, absolutely, my day job on working on climate issues and working a lot in Africa and South Asia certainly informs my view of the world. My most recent book is an essay on the relationship between the humanities and the climate crisis, called Last Exit. But at this point, I would say that the environment is present in the sense that the landscape has a big role to play, the desert and the mountains. But at that point, I wasn't thinking about the climate crisis that consciously.
Well, certainly, and this is, I mean, one of the main themes that runs through all of the books is the sense of nature. In all of your work, nature is an incredibly powerful presence. I wanted to ask you just the last question, just for the moment. A reviewer spoke about the malleability of consciousness. Can you just talk to us a little bit more about that in what you were doing with Tomás? Just expand upon it a little bit.
Well, actually, after some years later, but relating to that passage that I read, I've come into contact with these theories of the modularity of the mind. So the fact that we have cognitive systems that there is no central self, and that this could relate to theory. I'm not a big expert on Buddhism. I've read more on Sufism, and the Sufis have the idea that our everyday personality, what we consider ourselves, it's really a false self, and that one needs to go through excruciating years of training to refine one's self into a more real self. But basically, that idea that one plays different roles and that has different personalities, this theory of a modular mind is that we don't have a CEO inside, a central self, but rather different systems that come into place at different times. And some people can manipulate that, if they want to, convince us to do something. Want to persuade us to buy something or to buy into an ideology.
And this
but again, our mind is fluctuating that way, and that's something that I wasn't familiar with when I wrote this novel.
Okay, so is it accident then that Tomás Ugarte is an advertising executive, because that seems to fit?
Well,
perfectly.
Yes, he is a professional of persuasion, and I've been interested in this idea of the manipulated mind a long time. I love reading books about brainwashing, for instance, which is a non-scientific term. It was invented by a CIA agent during the Korean War, when prisoners of war appeared on film suddenly reciting communist credo, and the people were like, what's going on? And they came up with the term brainwashing, which is very unscientific. But now after the Korean War, there's been studies about sudden conversion and people going even back to study St. Paul's or other religious conversion or sects or cults or whatever. And that includes advertising and other forms of persuasion.
So your emotional storage, may I ask you, from when you were young, is that part of the Chilean landscape?
Yes, I was thinking about what Moya was saying, but also I was thinking a writer that I admire very much, Doris Lessing, sometimes says that the emotional fuel of a novel not necessarily is congruent with the story you're telling. Sure. So you could be very angry about something, and that could fuel a novel that doesn't have to necessarily do with that anger. And I've found that to be very true. Most things that Doris Lessing says I find to be true. Yeah.
I agree. Jordi, can I return to you just for a moment, please, and just to ask you about this duality of having been born in Mexico and living in Spain, and what that does to your perspective on both countries, and indeed, how do you feel the modern Spain regards modern Mexico?
Bueno, yo soy un mestizo canónico. Mi madre es española y mi padre es mexicano.
I am mestizo, mixed race. My mother is Spanish, my father is Mexican.
Y esto me ha dado desde que era pequeño una perspectiva global de los dos países.
And this has given me a global perspective of both countries.
Para ser breve, citaré a Alfonso Reyes, uno de nuestros grandes ensayistas.
So in order to be brief, I am going to quote Alfonso Reyes, one of our great essayists.
Que era un escritor mexicano que vivió mucho tiempo en España y conocía muy bien los dos países.
He was a Mexican writer who lived for a long time in Spain, and he knew both countries very well.
Y tenía una idea de las semejanzas entre los dos países que yo suscribo totalmente. Decía, quien no conoce España no puede conocer bien México.
He used to say, he who doesn't know Spain cannot know Mexico well. He had this idea about the similarities between both countries, which I totally subscribe to.
España creció en diversos países de Latinoamérica de otra manera. España se quedó como era y se convirtió en otra cultura en un montón de países en Latinoamérica.
So Spain grew in Latin America. Spain stayed as it was, and somehow it grew and became different cultures all around the continent of South America.
La forma en que creció España en México, que es mi caso, creció de una manera amestizada por la cultura prehispánica.
So the way Spain expanded in Mexico is with a mix of cultures, the Spanish culture and the pre-Hispanic culture.
Pero a mí me queda muy claro, al conocer muy bien los dos países, que tenemos muchas más similitudes que diferencias.
But as someone who knows both countries well, I am convinced that we have more similarities than differences.
Y el México moderno, el México contemporáneo, me parece que es un país del siglo XXI, de la parte occidental del mundo, y que también conserva toda su profundidad prehispánica.
And contemporary Mexico to me is a Western modern country that preserves its pre-Hispanic culture.
Okay, thank you. Sergio, what about in Chile? What do you think is the relationship between Spain and Chile? I was watching something recently about the Mapuche and how they are branded as terrorists or freedom fighters, depending on which side of the fence you're on, but that they feel that they have been put out of their lands for the last 500 years and they are fighting to get territorial rights back. So is there that big division in Chile, or is this just a minority that people don't pay attention to? Or what is the relationship between, if you like, settled Chile and the indigenous peoples?
It's a very complex, big question. But Chile is part of what is called the southern cone of South America. And I would say a common narrative has been that the southern cone is European, more European than other areas of Latin America. And I think that has been an official narrative that has denied our indigenous heritage, not only Mapuche, but others. Mm-hmm. So that narrative is being questioned right now. There's been a debate about a constitution. There was a referendum where the draft was rejected. But I think, and that draft recognized Chile as a plurinational country. Okay. So there's a very complex history. The specificity of the Mapuche is that there was a lot of mestizaje, and I don't know the translation exactly, maybe miscegenation, mixture. Yeah. But not the Mapuche, because they were very belligerent and they lived in a very inaccessible area. Mm-hmm. So the Spaniards conquered Chile very quickly, and before that the Incas had established dominion over Chile until they hit that region in the south where the Mapuche were entrenched, and they were only pacified, is the euphemism used mm-hmm. In history books, in the late 19th century due to technologies of war. At the same time that in Argentina there was a big genocide of native populations on the other side of the Andes, mm-hmm. Called la campaña del desierto, the campaign of the desert. So yeah. That's why the Mapuche now are homogeneous and have a stronger sense of identity and a stronger sense of resistance of the Chilean state. But then again, I would say that narrative of the southern cone being European, it no longer holds.
Isn't it interesting that the word pacified was used to indicate something which was probably completely its opposite?
Yes, incredibly violent.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not saying for a moment that we have those kind of huge differences on this small island as in a continent of South America, but I just want to make a reference to that awful tragedy that happened in Donegal. And Donegal people, all of the people from Donegal that I would know, would say that they do feel themselves to be very different, much more stalwart, much more resilient than the general population. So I'm just wondering if you have any view on that. And certainly they have demonstrated that in the last week, that extraordinary sense of community that has pulled everybody together. Is that overstated, do you think?
Maybe a tiny bit.
That's okay.
Maybe a tiny bit. No, I mean, I think that is one of the features of rural communities.
Yeah.
You know, you mightn't have as much privacy as you have in a city,
Yeah.
but you will, in times of crisis, have incredible support. I remember Raymond Williams talking about the same in Wales. He was saying just when his parents died, you had sort of almost the equivalent of the wake here. People arrive with food, they just take over, and etc. I think that's part of a lot of rural culture still.
You don't think it's any stronger, particularly in Donegal?
I don't really. I mean, it's absolutely part of Ulster. There's no question of that. You know, so it is a lot of the features of Ulster society. The little village which I grew up in, which is pretty far northwest in Fanahy, but it was planted after the famine. Oh no, not what am I talking about? It was during the Ulster plantation. It was the point furthest west, which was planted. So there's a tiny Protestant community on the headland behind us, very poor actually, poor farmers have been there. So you have certainly the same thing that you get in Northern Ireland. You have a community which is just mixed religiously, and with all that is good in that, as well as all, you know, sort of. So it sees itself as part of Ulster. I'm not sure. I think you might have got the same kind of community cohesion had such a disaster happened in Mayo or Connemara you know, it's one. I mean, so many of the novels, you know, of the 19th or 20th century Irish novels, were people trying to, you know, to break away from that sense of community, that you're just part of community, you're not an individual at all.
Okay.
But I think that now that we are beginning to see the negative sides of a much too individualist society, people are beginning to value community
more. Yeah.
And it was just one of these appalling tragedies which resonate with other tragedies. The Ironmore drowning, etc. All of these.
But you think in general I should tell my Donegal friends to get over themselves? Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't put that as quite as strongly as that either.
I don't know how we're doing for time. Do we have time to? Where's Laura? Any time for questions for the audience? Any idea what time it is? 6:30. Oh, I'll be shot. Do we have time for a quick question or two maybe from the audience, if there are any? I know it's always hard to ask the first one, but if there are any, we can sneak them in.
I once was at a Peruvian writer and he said, let's go straight to the second question.
That's a good idea. What about the second question? Okay, yes? We need to be. Okay, there you go. Sorry about that, folks.
And no question about it.
No question about it. All that remains for me is to thank most sincerely my three guests. Thank you very much. And please, just go out and read these wonderful works. They will lift your spirits, which is, after all, what literature is all about. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
RTE supporting the arts.
Supporting artists.
Supporting us.